This week, we'll be looking at the arguments of Kant's first and second analogies of experience that concern the concepts of substance and cause. And we'll be looking at Kant's refutation of idealism, which is a proof of the external world. Before we look at these arguments in detail, though, let's think about Kant's general question of how synthetic a priori knowledge is possible. At A158, B197, Kant tells us general answer to the question of how synthetic a priori knowledge is possible. Kant explains that while what makes analytic judgments possible is the principle of non-contradiction, and what makes synthetic empirical judgments possible are particular experiences, what makes synthetic a priori judgments possible are the conditions of the possibility of experience. What we want to understand now is, in particular, what synthetic a priori knowledge we're entitled to have. What does our synthetic a priori knowledge consist in? What judgments can we make about objects, independently of any particular experiences, on the basis of the conditions of the possibility of our experience? In the first analogy, Kant aims to display our right to the judgment that all change is the mere alteration of substance which persists. And in the second analogy, Kant seeks to display our entitlement to the judgment that every alteration is governed by the law of cause and effect. Now, the way Kant's arguments in the analogies proceed is by identifying an empirical judgment we have the right to make about the temporality of our experience, and showing that this empirical judgment presupposes a synthetic a priori judgment, employing the concept of substance or of cause. In the first analogy, which concerns the concept of substance, Kant articulates this empirical judgment by writing, all appearances are in time, in which, as substratum, both simultaneity as well as succession can alone be represented. So the premise here is that we can judge that certain appearances are simultaneous, while other appearances are successive. The first question in interpreting the first analogy is what simultaneous and successive mean in this context. Kant's second premise in this argument is that we can distinguish simultaneous and successive appearances only if we already have a piece of synthetic a priori knowledge. That is, only if we already know that in all change of appearances, substance persists through that change, and the change of appearances is merely the alteration of that substance. To understand what Kant's first premise means, let's think about two sorts of changes in our experience. In certain cases, two objects exist at the same time, and our experience begins with the one and then changes to the other. So for example, suppose there's a frog and a log that both exist for a half hour. For the first 15 minutes, I attend to the frog, and then my attention shifts to the log for the next 15 minutes. In the first 15 minutes, when I'm attending to the frog, the log exists, though I'm not attending to it. And in the second 15 minutes, the frog exists, even though I'm not attending to it. This is what Kant wants to call experience of simultaneity. There are two objects existing simultaneously, even though my apprehension of these objects is successive, in the sense that first I observe the frog, and then I observe the log. The other sort of case, which Kant calls succession, is when I observe a burning log for 15 minutes, for example, and then I observe its ashes for the next 15 minutes. In this case, the objects are not simultaneous. The ashes don't exist when the log exists, and the log does not exist when the ashes exist. Here, it's not my attention that shifts from a log to ashes, but it's the object itself that changes from being a log to being ashes. Now, Kant takes for granted, in the first analogy, that we can draw this distinction. Of course, there are some cases where I misidentify a successive existence as a simultaneous one, and there are some cases in which I misidentify a simultaneous existence as a successive one. If I don't know much about the life cycle of butterflies, I might mistakenly think that someone has replaced my caterpillar with a butterfly, when in fact, the caterpillar has become a butterfly. Of course, we make these sorts of mistakes, but Kant's claim is that it's at least possible for us to get it right. It's at least possible for us to distinguish experiences of simultaneous appearances from experiences of successive ones. So the question Kant asks is how, on what basis, can we draw this distinction in principle? Now, Kant points out that it can't be on the basis of our apprehension itself that we draw this distinction. Kant writes, our apprehension of the manifold of appearance is always successive. We can therefore never determine from this alone whether the object of experience is simultaneous or successive. So the thought here is that if I look at the log, look away, and then look back and see a frog, it's not obvious from the looks of things that the log didn't turn into a frog. And by the same token, if I look at a log, look away, and then look back and see ashes, it's not obvious from the looks of things that the log turned into the ashes. Kant also notes that we cannot perceive time by itself. Why is this relevant? Or what does it even mean? Kant's thought here is that while the objects of our experiences are always in time, we can't experience an object's temporal history in experiencing that object. So while I can see a heap of ashes now, I can't see the temporal history of that heap of ashes when I'm seeing the ashes. When I'm seeing the ashes, I can't see that 15 minutes ago, these ashes were a log. By the same token, if I'm looking at a frog right now, I can't see that this thing has been a frog for the past half hour. If I could see everything's temporal history in the moment that I see the thing, then on this basis, I could distinguish simultaneity and succession. But of course, we can't do that. So something else must stand in for time. And now Kant's claim is that substance is what stands in for time. Kant writes, "It is in the objects of perception, that is, the appearances, that the substratum must be encountered that represents time in general, and in which all change or simultaneity can be perceived in apprehension through the relation of the appearances to it." He continues, "The substratum of everything real is substance, of which everything that belongs to existence can be thought only as a determination. Or alternatively, only in that which persists are temporal relations possible. That is, that which persists is the substratum of the empirical representation of time itself, by which alone all time determination is possible." So Kant's thought here is that the way I represent a succession in the objects of my experience, as opposed to a mere succession of my experiences, representing simultaneous objects, is by representing the former case, the case of a succession in the objects of my experience, as an alteration in an underlying substance. So the idea is, I can represent the log as changing into ashes, as opposed to the log being replaced by ashes, by representing a substance persisting that underlies the log and the ashes both, such that the change from log into ashes is merely the alteration of this underlying, persisting substance. Now, Kant's second analogy concerning the concept of cause builds on his first analogy in a way. Having shown that all change is the mere alteration of a substance which persists, Kant now aims to show that all alteration is governed by the law of cause and effect. His argument in the second analogy has the same general form as his argument in the first analogy. Kant seeks to identify a piece of empirical knowledge and show that that empirical knowledge presupposes some synthetic a priori knowledge. While in the first analogy, Kant's first premise was that we can distinguish simultaneity from succession. In his second analogy, Kant's first premise is that we can distinguish objective and subjective succession. Kant begins by writing, "The apprehension of the manifold of appearance is always successive. The representation of the parts succeed one another. Whether they also succeed in the object is a second point of reflection, which is not contained in the first." So while in the first analogy, Kant asked us to consider how we can have knowledge of succession and not mere simultaneity, when our apprehension is always successive. Here in the second analogy, Kant's asking how we can have knowledge of objective succession as opposed to merely subjective succession, when our experience is always successive. Again, we have to ask ourselves, what's the difference here between objective and subjective succession? Kant offers two examples. They're the examples of a house and a ship. Kant writes of the house, "The apprehension of the manifold in the appearance of a house that stands before me is successive." Now, the question is whether the manifold of this house itself is also successive, which certainly no one will concede. Kant explains, "My perceptions could have begun at its rooftop and ended at the ground, but also could have begun below and ended above. Likewise, I could have apprehended the manifold of empirical intuition from the right or from the left. In the series of these perceptions, there was therefore no determinate order that made it necessary when I had to begin in the apprehension in order to combine the manifold empirically." This contrasts with the case of seeing a ship driven downstream. Kant explains that in this second case, my perception of the ship's position downstream follows the perception of its position upstream, and it's impossible that in the apprehension of this appearance, the ship should first be perceived downstream and afterwards upstream. The order in the sequence of the perceptions, Kant explains, is therefore here determined, and the apprehension is bound to it. Kant marks this distinction by calling cases like the ship being driven downstream happenings or occurrences. So Kant's premise in the second analogy is that we can have empirical knowledge of happenings or of occurrences, where to have empirical knowledge of a happening is to have a determinate order to one's apprehension. So in the observation of a house, nothing happens, because I could first observe its rooftop and then its foundation, or I could first observe its north facade and then its west facade, or just the same, I could first observe its foundation and then its rooftop, or I could first observe its west facade and then its north facade. In my observation of a house, nothing happens, which is just to say, the order of my various apprehensions of the house is not determined. The order of my apprehending the house could proceed in one way just as much as in the opposite. But when I observe a happening or an occurrence, this is not the case. In the case where I see a ship driven downstream, I first observe the ship upstream, and then I observe the ship downstream, and it couldn't be the opposite. I couldn't observe first the ship downstream, and then the ship upstream. Now, just as in the case of the first analogy, Kant's not saying we never mistake happenings for non-happenings, or non-happenings for happenings. All Kant is saying is that it's at least in principle possible for us to get it right. We can distinguish the case of observing a happening from the case of observing a non-happening. We can draw the distinction between a determinate order of our apprehension from an indeterminate order. And as in the case of the first analogy, the question is how this is possible. What enables us to draw this distinction between happenings and non-happenings? What gives us a right to claim that we've observed a happening as opposed to a non-happening? As in the argument of the first analogy, Kant points out that there's nothing in our apprehension itself, in the qualities of the objects apprehended, that enables us to draw this distinction. Kant writes, every apprehension of an occurrence is a perception that follows another one. Since this is the case in all synthesis of apprehension, however, the apprehension of an occurrence is not yet thereby distinguished from any other. So the thought is, when I'm observing the house's north facade and then its west facade, I know that I could just as well observe its west facade and then its north facade. But this knowledge isn't grounded in the looks of the house's north and west facade. There's nothing in my apprehension of these two facades that indicates their order is indeterminate. And just the same, in apprehending the ship upstream and then downstream, there's nothing in the look of the ship upstream or in the look of the ship downstream that indicates that my apprehension had to come in this order as opposed in the opposite order. Now, Kant's claim is that what justifies me in judging that something happened is connecting two states of an object in accordance with a rule. He writes, the connection must consist in the order of the manifold of appearance in accordance with which the apprehension of one thing, that which happens, follows that of the other, which proceeds in accordance with a rule. Only thereby can I be justified in saying of the appearance itself, and not merely my apprehension, that a sequence is to be encountered in it, which is as much to say as that I cannot arrange the apprehension otherwise than in exactly this sequence. Kant concludes, if, therefore, we experience that something happens, then we always presuppose that something else precedes it, which follows in accordance with a rule. Now, of course, the rule Kant has in mind here is the law of cause and effect. So Kant's idea is that I represent the order in my apprehension of the ship upstream and then the ship downstream as a determined order by representing the actual ship's location upstream together with the current as the cause of the ship's actual location downstream. As Kant puts it, in this case, I derive the subjective sequence of apprehension from the objective sequence of appearances. The succession of the ship upstream and then the ship downstream in my apprehension is a determined succession precisely because the ship upstream and the current is the cause of the ship downstream. By contrast, the way I'm able to represent the order of the north facade and the west facade of the house in my apprehension as indeterminate, such that the west facade could have come first and the north facade second, is by not representing any rule-governed causal relation between the north facade and the west facade of the house. Now, this is meant to provide an argument against Hume, since it's meant to show that a piece of empirical knowledge that Hume would acknowledge we have isn't possible except on the presupposition of our synthetic a priori knowledge that every occurrence stands under the law of cause and effect, which Hume supposes we don't have. So the question that you should consider if you choose to write your paper this week on Kant's second analogy is how well you think Kant's argument refutes the Humean skeptic. So in particular, would the Humean grant Kant's first premise that we can distinguish objective from subjective succession? And if so, is Kant right that the only way we can distinguish objective and subjective succession is by representing objective successions as governed by the law of cause and effect? A worry is that Kant's first premise lays claim not to empirical cognition, but to synthetic a priori cognition. When Kant draws this contrast between objective and subjective succession, he says, in cases of subjective succession, the series of perceptions had no determinate order that made it necessary. So does Kant think that in the case of objective successions, there's a necessity to the order of my apprehensions? If so, is this an illicit assumption in an argument against Hume? After all, Kant claims that necessity is a mark of the a priori, so you should consider whether Kant has illicitly snuck synthetic a priori knowledge into his premise in the second analogy. Another question you might want to consider if you write your paper on the second analogy is what the relationship is between the second analogy and transcendental idealism. Specifically, does Kant think that there's an argument from the premise that we can distinguish objective and subjective successions to the conclusion that transcendental idealism is true, that is, to the conclusion that our knowledge is of appearances only and not things in themselves. Kant seems to suggest as much when he writes, "If appearances were things in themselves, then no human being would be able to assess from the succession of representations how the manifold is combined in the object." So in this passage, Kant seems to be suggesting that if the objects of our possible experience were things in themselves, then we could never know that a particular experience is the experience of a happening, or in other words, that there's an objective succession or a determinate order of our states of apprehension. So in writing your paper, you might consider the force of this argument. Is Kant right that the transcendental realist can't account for empirical knowledge of objective succession or empirical knowledge of occurrences? And if Kant is right, is that a good argument against the transcendental realist? Let's now turn to Kant's refutation of idealism. So Kant identifies his skeptical opponent as an external world skeptic in the first paragraph of the Refutation of Idealism at B274. He does this by distinguishing Descartes' idealism from Berkeley's idealism. He writes, "Idealism is the theory that declares the existence of objects in space outside us to be either merely doubtful and indemonstrable, or else false and impossible." Kant explains that the former is the problematic idealism of Descartes, who declares only one empirical assertion, namely I am, to be indubitable, and the latter is the dogmatic idealism of Berkeley, who declares space, together with all the things to which it is attached, as an inseparable condition, to be something that is impossible in itself, and who therefore also declares things in space to be merely imaginary. Now Kant claims that the ground for Berkeleyan idealism is undercut in the transcendental aesthetic. And so for this reason, Kant's refutation of idealism takes on Descartes' problematic idealism. Now, of course, Descartes doesn't deny that there is an external world. To the contrary, Descartes provides a proof of the external world in his sixth meditation. But what Kant aims to oppose here is Descartes' skeptical method. In the first meditation, Descartes endeavors to show what can be doubted. He argues, first, since the senses are occasionally unreliable, the contents of one's sense experience can be doubted. Next, Descartes argues that since veridical and illusory sensory experiences are subjectively indistinguishable, we have reason to doubt the existence of the entire external world, and indeed, we have reason to doubt the reality of the past. Descartes then argues that since we don't know whether our minds were created by an all-powerful God, and indeed, since we don't know God's nature, or whether our minds were brought about by chance, we have reason to doubt even the general truths of mathematics and logic. Yet in the second meditation, Descartes argues that the proposition I am cannot be doubted, so long as the proposition is entertained. So at this point in meditation 2, Descartes supposes that my awareness of my own mental states can't be wrong, yet my experience of the external world can be wrong. So in this sense, Descartes privileges inner experience over outer experience. Descartes thinks that inner experience is indubitable, while outer experience is doubtable. This is the position that Kant seeks to oppose in his refutation of idealism. He aims to show against Descartes that inner experience is possible only under the presupposition of outer experience. So in other words, Kant thinks that Descartes cannot be in the position that he takes himself to be in meditation 2. Kant aims to show that it's impossible to doubt the existence of the external world, so long as one is aware of one's own existence. As Kant puts the thesis, the mere but empirically determined consciousness of my own existence proves the existence of objects in space outside me. The first premise in Kant's proof of this thesis is I am conscious of my existence as determined in time. So is this a premise that Descartes does accept or would accept in meditation 2? Of course, Descartes accepts that I'm aware of my own existence. But am I aware of my own existence in time? Now, of course, Kant's aesthetic has argued that time is the form of inner sense. So perhaps, while Descartes himself doesn't claim that I'm aware of my own existence as determined in time, Kant can argue that insofar as one is aware of one's own existence, one must be aware of one's own existence as determined in time. A potential problem, though, is that Descartes denies the reality of the past. So Kant would beg the question against Descartes if his premise were that my memories have a veridical time determination. For example, I seem to remember that yesterday I ate dinner and then I ate ice cream. Descartes' skeptical argument in the first meditation is that because memories are subjectively indistinguishable from dreams, I can't be sure that these memories are veridical. That is, I can't be sure that, in fact, I had dinner yesterday and then I had ice cream. So if Kant's premise is assuming that the time sequence of my memories is veridical, he would beg the question against the Cartesian skeptic. So a more charitable interpretation of Kant's first premise wouldn't commit him to the veridicality of my memories, but merely to the temporal ordering of my memories themselves. In other words, Kant's premise is that it seems to me that my inner experience is time determined. That is, I seem to remember eating dinner yesterday and then having ice cream. So on this interpretation, Kant's first premise, that I am conscious of my existence as determined in time, only commits Kant to the claim that my inner experience presents itself as temporally ordered, or that my inner experience seems to have a temporal ordering, not that this temporal ordering is an accurate representation of anything outside of my inner experience. This is a premise that the Cartesian skeptic of Meditation 1 would accept. The second premise in Kant's refutation is all time determination presupposes something persistent in perception. Now, this is surely meant to be a result from the first analogy. Kant's third premise reads, this persistent thing, however, cannot be something in me, since my own existence in time can first be determined only through this persistent thing. So this is the crucial premise in Kant's argument, for it's this premise that states that the persistent thing that makes it possible for me to be aware of my inner experience as temporal can't be an object in my inner experience itself, so must instead be an object in my outer experience. So what's the reasoning? Why can't the persistent thing be an object in my inner experience? What Kant seems to say in this sentence is that the persistent thing cannot be something in my inner experience because my inner experience in time can first be determined only through a persistent thing. And this would completely beg the question. What Kant is trying to argue in the refutation is that my awareness of my own existence presupposes objects outside of me. So it had better not be a premise in Kant's argument that my awareness of my own existence in time can be determined only through a persistent thing outside of me. I think it's for this reason that Kant wanted to replace this sentence in his refutation with the sentence contained in the footnote. As Kant explains in his preface, Kant sent his manuscript for the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason to the publisher with the sentence, this persistent thing cannot be something in me, since my own existence in time can first be determined only through this persistent thing. But then, after sending his manuscript to the publisher, Kant wanted to edit this sentence, and he asked the publisher to replace the sentence with the sentence that occurs in the footnote. But the publisher had already typeset the Critique of Pure Reason and was unwilling to change the sentence. So instead, Kant added an addendum to his preface, in which he instructed the reader to strike the sentence that appears in the refutation and replace it with the sentence that's included in the footnote. So what Kant wanted his third premise to say was, this persistent thing, however, cannot be an intuition in me, for all grounds of determination of my existence that can be encountered in me are representations, and as such require some persistent thing that is distinct even from them, in relation to which their change, thus my existence in time in which they change, can be determined. Now, this premise doesn't obviously beg the question, since Kant doesn't state that the persistent thing can't be in me, since my awareness of myself presupposes my awareness of things in space outside of me. But what does the third premise say? The first difference is that instead of saying that the persistent thing cannot be something in me, Kant instead says the persistent thing cannot be an intuition in me. But I don't think this is an important difference, since an intuition is just the presentation of a thing to me. So Kant's claim is still that the persistent thing cannot be something that is presented in inner intuition to me. The key difference is Kant's reason. Instead of question-beggingly stating that my awareness of myself presupposes my awareness of things outside of me, Kant instead remarks on the nature of my inner experience. He says that everything I'm aware of in my inner experience are mere representations. To see what Kant means by this, I think it's useful to reflect on qualitative and numerical identity. So as regards the objects of my outer experience, two objects can be qualitatively identical, but numerically distinct. Right? There can be two objects that look totally alike, but yet are different objects. And so in the case of outer experience, if we see a copy of the Critique of Pure Reason, and then again see a copy of the Critique of Pure Reason, we can ask, is the first copy of the Critique of Pure Reason I saw the very same object as the second copy of the Critique of Pure Reason I saw? Or do they just look alike without being numerically identical? So the thought here is that that question makes sense with respect to the objects of my outer experience. With respect to the objects of my outer experience, it makes sense to distinguish qualitative and numerical identity. But does this distinction make sense with respect to my inner experience? So consider a pain, for example. Suppose every time I go on an airplane, I feel a pain on the right side in the back of my neck. Now, suppose I go to the doctor, and I tell the doctor, every time I fly, I feel this pain on the right side in the back of my neck. Now suppose the doctor asks me, is it the very same pain that you feel? Or is it a variety of pains that all feel the same way? Would this question make any sense? I don't think it would. If I feel a stabbing pain in my neck today, and a dull pain in my neck a month from now, I would say that these are different pains because their qualities are different. They feel differently. If, by contrast, I feel a dull pain in the back of my neck today and a dull pain in the back of my neck in a month, I would say these are the same pain precisely because they feel the same. There's no further question whether they merely feel the same or whether they actually are numerically identical. In my inner experience, all there is the representations, as Kant puts it. There's no object in inner experience over and above the representations. In other words, in inner experience, I'm simply aware of qualities. I'm aware of sharp stabbing pains, or dull pains, or throbbing pains, but I'm not aware of something that has the pains. This is in contrast to outer experience, where I'm aware not only of qualities, but also of the objects that bear the qualities. I'm aware not just of bright red, but of bright red apples. So now Kant's argument and the refutation is that because I am aware of my own inner experience as having temporal determinations, even if those temporal determinations are non-veridical. And since I can be aware of temporal determinations only if I'm aware of some persisting thing, and because there are no things in inner sense, but only qualities, it follows that I must be aware of things outside of me. So this is Kant's conclusion in the refutation. The determination of my existence in time is possible only by means of the existence of actual things that I perceive outside myself. Now, how satisfying is this argument against the Cartesian skeptic? Kant acknowledges, in Note 3 on B278, that from the fact that the existence of outer objects is required for the possibility of a determinate consciousness of ourself, it does not follow that every intuitive representation of outer things includes at the same time their existence. For that may well be the mere effect of the imagination, in dreams as well as in delusion. Kant explains that here it has been proved only that inner experience in general is possible through outer experience in general. So what Kant's acknowledging here is that not all of our outer experiences are veridical experiences. We of course have dreams and illusions and hallucinations. But what Kant has proved, he thinks, is that we couldn't have dreams or delusions or hallucinations unless at some point we had a veridical experience of the external world. So in other words, Kant hasn't undercut the first skeptical argument that Descartes gives in the first meditation, but he has undercut the second skeptical argument. Kant hasn't shown that we have reason to trust every one of our sense experiences. So Kant hasn't removed skepticism about individual sense experiences. But what he has removed is global external world skepticism. He's removed the doubt that all of my sense experiences are illusory or hallucinatory. He's argued that I couldn't seem to have a temporally ordered awareness of my own representative states unless at least one of those representative states were the experience of an actually existing external world. So now in your papers, spell out and evaluate this argument in more detail. Now, as I said at the beginning,